It's really interesting seeing the general public become aware that the gaming journalism industry is biased towards Sony. And sometimes for really weird reasons. Of course, we always talk about like games like The Last of Us Part 2 and Spider-Man 2 and God of War Ragnarok and Horizon Forbidden West being hyped up way more than they probably should, considering their obvious problems, right? But when it comes to like an objective reality, when it comes to like how game journalists cover certain kinds of stories and seeing how they act when it comes to Sony versus everyone else, it becomes undeniable, right? These aren't journalists coming out in support of their favorite games and their favorite developers. They are journalists coming out in support of the company that is signing their paychecks. And that is exactly what we're seeing with the Insomniac leak situation. Right now, game journalists are bending over backwards to complain about the leaks, talking about how unfair it is, how it makes Insomniac look bad, how it's bad for the industry and stuff like that. Meanwhile, a lot of these same people were really gung ho about leaks from other companies, Rockstar, Bethesda, Capcom, to name a few, right? Like, it's not unheard of for leaks to surface on Twitter or on other platforms. But what happens whenever it's not a Sony owned subsidiary is that journalists are some of the people who are most aggressively covering it, right? They are covering the information, they are covering the situation, they are like there, just distributing the information, commenting on it, like doing whatever, right? They're perfectly fine pushing Switch 2 rumors or like, pushing Nintendo conspiracies or pushing like completely fake narratives. But like the instant that Sony looks bad, whether it comes, whether it involves like the quality of their upcoming games, the budgets of their recently released games, when it comes to like layoffs, when it comes to like the way they've been conducting business, suddenly it becomes a problem, right? And what it comes down to is the fact that the gaming journalism industry is and always has been extremely biased towards Sony. Sony essentially controls them, right? Sony is the platform that gaming journalists are rooting for. This is very evident if you're a Nintendo or an Xbox fan and have seen how gaming journalists just religiously downplay everything that comes out on those platforms, right? Like it's obvious if you're not a Sony fan, right? And I think in this situation, even Sony fans are kind of acknowledging that the bias is getting out of hand, right? Because like how exactly are you going to justify the leaks and the damage control for video games from other companies, but then like turn around and like cry foul when like it happens to Sony, right? That is what we're seeing here. That is what we're being born witness to. Like that is what we're seeing. Currently, where we're at in the gaming sphere, in the Gamergate situation, is that people are in denial about the pro Sony bias. They're in denial about the bias against Nintendo. The existence of pretendos. Like the Nintendo tax. You know, like people are always treating every Nintendo game like it's gonna be the last one ever, right? It's the worst one they've ever put out. WarioWare got hit by that. Super Mario RPG got hit by that to a certain extent. Like you have a lot of people releasing all these crazy statements about like Enoma Zelda and like Mario Wonder and like Fire Emblem Engage, Pikmin. Like it's just nonstop, right? And I do think people really need to understand like what is actually happening here because Nintendo games are more popular than the competition. They're doing better, they're making more money, people like playing them more. 20 years later, people are still talking about and playing Pikmin, Super Mario RPG, you know, uh Advance Wars, right? Like there are just dozens of examples of all these games that are just continuing to be successful today But there's this very stubborn refusal from the gaming YouTube and gaming journalism scene to admit it. I just got done watching a video claiming that Advance Wars reboot can't fail, which is like laughable, right? That's not true at all, right? I'm still seeing people try to damage control Spider-Man 2 and Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart and like Sunset Overdrive. Right? All these games that are that have been put out by a declining company over the past decade that to this day nobody wants to admit is in decline, right? Because Insomniac was acquired by Sony, and if you were to admit that like Insomniac has been getting worse and worse and worse over the past decade, then that would, by association, be admitting that PlayStation has been getting worse. And we can't have that, right? We're not allowed to question Naughty Dog. We're not allowed to question Insomniac. We're not allowed to question Sucker Punch. We're not allowed to question the closure of PlayStation Studios or like the shift in direction from final of modern Final Fantasy or whatever, right? All of that is perfectly fine because it's what the company wants. It's all PlayStation stuff. But like when it comes to Nintendo stuff, like it's just everything is just mired in endless controversy, right? Just look at the situation between Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter Rise, right? The only real reason the divide between those games exists is because Monster Hunter World is promoted and loved among game journalists because it was it was a PlayStation game, right? It was pushed as a PlayStation game, right? And meanwhile, Rise went back to Nintendo hardware. So like Rise was pushed as being like a regressive entry in the series, and that we would get a real new Monster Hunter game on other consoles in a couple of years, and you know that was the narrative, right? And we're seeing that narrative continuing to be pushed this year with in spite of all Nintendo successes, in spite of everything they've put out, Zelda, Mario, Pokemon, Fire Emblem, like all this crazy stuff, Splatoon 3, like the industry is doing everything it possibly can to just kind of ignore it, just kind of pretend it doesn't exist while focusing wholeheartedly on stuff that nobody really cares about, right? Like it's crazy to think that like they're seriously talking about Cyberpunk 2 or the Wolverine game or like everything else that's coming out. When in reality, like I have no optimism for these products whatsoever, right? Like why would I care? It's like after the disaster of Spider-Man 2 and Cyberpunk 2077, why exactly would I be interested in the future of these properties? But according to gaming journalists, according to the industry, I should be excited for these products because they're major PlayStation titles. And PlayStation, according to these people, is by far the best in the industry.